Hello friends, good morning and welcome to the EduSat Network. Our topic of discussion today is Black American literature with special focus on fiction. And friends, this is part of our series on American literature that we have been running for quite some time. For this discussion and lecture, we have with us in our studio Dr. Bhim Singh Dahiya, retired professor of English and former vice chancellor of Kurukshetra University. Dr. Dahiya is presently an advisor to a reputed institute in North Delhi. Dr. Dahiya has taught English literature for over 4 decades at different universities in India and abroad. With this brief introduction, I would like to welcome sir. Thank you, sir, for coming.
Thank you very much. Well, speaking of Black American literature raises a vital question. And that question is, why do we, call this literature as Black American literature? There are histories of American literature which only say American literature or history of American literature. They don't use white or black. But if you go through them, the most standard one is by Robert Spiller and others. You find that these writers, black writers and other minority writers are not included in that history. Jews are included. But then Jews have the same color, white color. Blacks are left out. So that raises the question of who is a minority and who is a majority. The question ultimately boils down to power. Who occupies the position of power? Who controls the territory? Now, before these so-called Americans came from Europe in the early 17th century, 1607 began the migration from Europe to America. Although America had been discovered by Columbus in 1498 at the end of the 15th century. And when he discovered it, people were already living there. In fact, he had gone out in search of India. But then he reached America. Those days, it is the winds that will take you to wherever the winds are going. So rather than India, he reached America. And he called the people living there as Red Indians. He thought it was India, which it was not. But the fact is that people were living there in 14th century, even before that. They have been living there for 2000 years almost, when the Europeans came in the 17th century. Now, there have been people after 17th century too. Along with these whites came the blacks, because the slave trade started right there after the Renaissance. In the 17th century in America, it was at the peak because it was a vast continent and they needed people to work for them. So workers they brought from Africa as slaves, and they were chained right in the palm, you see, with a hole made there. And the whole day they would work on the farms, and at night they were tied with chains like animals. So the Americans are these Europeans. Those who were living before them are not called Americans, they are Red Indians. Those who came after them, they are called now African Americans. First they were Negroes, then they were Afro-Americans, and finally now they are called African Americans. Similarly, now they have another terminology for Indians, Chinese, Pakistanis who are settled there. They are called Asian Americans. So no one is American except them, because they have captured power. Others are not in power, therefore they don't belong to America. Only they do. And that is why the blacks had to write their own history of literature. These two volumes, for example, by C.W.E. Bigsby, Bigsby, the black American writer. Sorry, volume 1 is fiction, volume 2 is poetry and drama. They had to write it because they are not included in the main official history of American literature, hence the separate ones. And for all practical purposes, they are not only the minority, they are a sub-nation within America, living within with themselves, and not allowed to participate culturally, you see, in activities dominated by the whites. Although slavery was abolished officially in 1865 by Abraham Lincoln, and that caused civil war between the conservative South and the liberal North. And it was during the same war that Abraham Lincoln was shot dead. He had to lose his life. But then he did succeed in abolishing slavery from America. But that was only on paper, theoretically. By law, it was abolished. But practically, it continued for quite some time even thereafter. It was only in the 20th century, after World War I, and finally after World War II, that the blacks got their legitimate rights as citizens of that country. They can vote now, they can be elected, so on and so forth. Although the discrimination at the cultural level, at social level, continues. They are still separated by color, and their literature speaks of that separation. If you go through the writings of these black writers from beginning to end, beginning is mostly in the 19th century. So 19th and 20th, these 2 centuries, you have a series of major writers in poetry, in fiction, in drama, theater, and you will find consistently it is a literature where the sad story of the life of blacks in America is depicted. How under severe oppression they have been living for 2 centuries. Only recently they have got full rights. Now that oppression, one cannot say, is there. But then it was there. And this literature depicts, records that oppression intensely. How they were discriminated against, how they were made to work like animals, so on and so forth, and how they were not owned as Americans, and they were not allowed to own the territory as America. So that is the sad story of black literature. But then writers are writers. They may be black or they may be white. And great writers have great visions. And what great writers write is not limited to any community. As Tagore used to say, a writer writes for humanity, not for any linguistic community, nor for any territorial group, nor for any ethnic or religious group. They write for mankind as a whole. So that is the difference between a great writer and the smaller writers. There are writers who have value as community writers or religious writers or nationalist writers, but really great writers are above all these lower considerations, narrow considerations, and they have wider vision of humanity, and they write for the welfare of humanity. They uphold the value of morality. As Matthew Arnold, I always quote, used to say, literature addresses only one question, and that is how to live. But then he further says that how to live is a moral question. That involves the sense of what is right and what is wrong. And what is right is moral, and what is wrong is immoral. And right is and moral is whatever is good for mankind. And whatever is not good for mankind is evil. So there is no question of any nationality, any territorial allegiance, or any religious faith or ethnic, affinity. All these narrow boundaries are, crossed over by great writers. So with this background, we touch upon some of the black writers who are really major ones, the great ones. Today, since we will be dealing with the black American fiction or the black American novel, the first great black American novelist was Paul Dunbar, Paul Dunbar, Paul Dunbar. Well, he is known for many novels, but two or three are more important, which we better remember and, if possible, read them. One is the Uncalled, and the blacks are certainly uncalled because they are not wanted. The Uncalled. Similarly, the Fanatics, another novel, the Fanatics. And the third important I would rate is The Sport of the Gods. Sport, S-P-O-R-T, Sport of the Gods. So these are three important novels, although there are several more, but three I would rate as important ones. And these novels came in the early years, the first decade of the 20th century. The Fanatics, for example, was 1901, and The Sport of Gods, 1909. The Fanatics too, 1901. So the first decade of the 20th century. And the theme, of course, is the same. You can call them complaint novels, you can call them protest novels, you can call them black novels, which is one and the same thing, because essentially they are a protest against the ill treatment meted out to them by the dominant white community holding the power strings in America. William Dean Howells, who was a later 19th century white American novelist, very important one at that time, the leading one, who actually practiced and propagated also the literary theory of realism and naturalism, more realism. So he was theorist of realism in America. And Howell had great praise for Dunbar. He thought Dunbar was a great novelist, irrespective of color. Color is no consideration for any writer. The second great black American novelist I would rate is Richard Wright. In fact, Richard Wright received much greater attention than Dunbar had received as a writer. And his one book, which continues to be a classic even today, made all the difference. This came out in the 1940, Native Son. Native Son is the title of the novel, which is semi-autobiographical, based on Richard Wright's own life, because Wright's own parents, they were slaves, and they had known what slavery meant to the blacks, and how the child grew in those oppressive conditions, and how he became aggressive and almost militant. So Native Son, 1940, remains the landmark novel in black writing. Richard Wright was influenced by the Marxist ideology. The 1930s in general was the decade of Marxism. Even the whites, the Auden group, for example, W.H. Auden, they were known as the Marxist group. Auden was the leader of that group. Similarly, Richard Wright was influenced by Marxism, although he can't be labeled as a Marxist per se. But then influence was certainly there on his ideas. The kind of class analysis he makes, the social discrimination that he comes out with, that is on the lines Marx had drawn in his Das Kapital. Well, another book that Richard Wright is known for is his own autobiography, Black Boy, which he wrote in 1945. Black Boy, which again made an impact just like his Native Son. And that made him a leading black writer in America. Now, the next writer I would think of as really great was Ralph Ellison. Ellison, R-A-L-P-H, Ralph Ellison. And like Richard Wright, he is also best known by just one novel, although he wrote several others also. But like Native Son, he is also known for one novel called Invisible Man. Invisible Man. The title itself suggests the theme of the novel. The blacks, if they have to survive in the hostile climate of white America, they have to stay invisible. If they become visible, they will invite hostility. So the best way to survive, the strategy for survival is to remain invisible. That is why the hero of the novel, he remains invisible, he remains underground, he keeps changing his names, keeps changing his identity, so no one knows. So he has several names during the course of the story and several addresses, so that he finds very useful, because that is how he can escape the wrath of the white community. Now, as a novelist, Ralph Ellison also made a contribution in the sense that he went beyond realism and naturalism. And he said, describing the life of black people in the realistic style is to make it rather dull. And therefore, he added poetry to the novel. He added poetic intensity to the novel and added intensive contemplation, monologue, soliloquy, and intensive recording of the individual consciousness as it is caught up in a social milieu which is not very friendly to him. So he worked out a different fictional style, different from Richard Wright. Richard Wright was more of a realist and a naturalist. So in realism and naturalism you have very tiring details of mundane life, everyday life. So describing every little thing, every small thing, that is the style of realism. Now, Ellison doesn't do that. Ellison focuses on the more, disturbing things in the consciousness of the individual. So he is not going after the surface details of life. He is going into the very psyche of the black. What is it that pierces and pinches the black conscience and black consciousness? So that brings about a new style altogether, which is more poetic, which is more symbolic, and less realistic and naturalistic. When you think of Ralph Ellison, you do think of compulsively of James Joyce, because James Joyce had evolved that style much earlier. That was after World War I. In fact, his first book of short stories, Dubliners, that had come out in 1918 and 1914, in fact. After the war came out as novels, The Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, famous, which again is autobiographical. But then here again is individual consciousness against social milieu, which is not very friendly. And James Joyce was an Irishman. So Irishmen at one level face the same discrimination in England as the blacks do. Of course, they have the white color, but then they are not really treated as equal. Englishman doesn't treat either the Irish or the Scottish or the Welsh as equal. You remember Hamlet. Am I the peasant slave? So peasant and slave are just one and the same. And the Irish only do the peasant work. They are by and large peasantry. So all agriculture is mostly in Ireland. Scotland, it is sheep breeding and so on. They provide wool. The British only rule all over because lands are owned by the lords, and the lords are British, English. These Irish only work. So Ralph Ellison has much to owe to James Joyce in his fictional style, his fictional concerns. The next novelist I would like to speak of is James Baldwin, who comes after Ralph Ellison. And here is a quotation from James Baldwin, which explains a good deal about him. He says, everyone's life begins on a level where races, armies, and churches stop. Full stop. And yet, everyone's life is always shaped by races, churches, and armies. See the real contradiction of life. You are shaped by these cultural forces of religion and race and community. At the same time, the individual is not entirely made by these forces. He is ultimately an individual beyond all these levels of his life given by, shaped by these forces. A very perceptive remark. And James Baldwin is best known by a novel called Go Tell It on the Mountain. Go Tell It on the Mountain. Where John Grimes is the hero. Grimes, John Grimes. Well, Baldwin wrote many more novels than Richard Wright or Ellison had done. Another novel to be noted is The Fire Next Time. The Fire Next Time. Still another is Giovanni's Room. Giovanni. Apostrophe S, Giovanni's Room. And yet another country. And the last I would speak of is Tell Me How Long the Train Has Been Gone. Tell me how long the train has been gone. Well, here again, the titles speak a good deal about the condition of the black. It may be The Fire Next Time. You see, the blacks, there was a time when burned alive by the whites. Any kind of little suspicion, even a small theft of a few coins, that could invite this, and no law would protect you. Later, of course, when the blacks became rather militant about their rights, they started hitting back, and they will also set fire to the houses of the whites and so on. So the Fire Next Time suggests this fire on both sides. how conditions provoke fire in American society. Another country similarly suggests the condition there, because that is no country for them. You remember Yeats, this is no country for old man. And that is about Ireland. Young ones in one another's arms and so on. So that was precisely the feeling with the blacks there, that America is no country for them. Because they are not treated as humans, not to speak of equals. So they had suffered all those humiliations. And that comes out in the title, Another Country. So they would rather think of Africa. They would think of any other territory than America as their home. That's why part of their writing is nostalgic. They feel nostalgia about their real homeland, which was Africa, from where they were brought as slaves. But now they can't go back. They can only remember. They can only visualize what life was there. At least it was a home, however backward it might be, but they had no oppression. They had no feeling of being aliens, being unwanted. So home is a home where you feel at home. You remember Frost has something to say. He says, a home is where when you go back, they have to, where when you go, they have to take you back. So that is your home, you have a claim there. But here you have no claim. You may be born there for several generations, and yet you continue to be an outsider. So that is the feeling. During the Harlem Renaissance, which was the peak of their social as well as literary movement in the 1920s, the slogan at that time was, if we must die. Actually, these words come from Churchill. You know, Churchill was a great speaker, and partly because of his speeches during World War II, that England and Allies, they won the war. So one of his famous speeches is, if we must die, oh, let us nobly die. That is the full sentence. If we must die, let us nobly die. So that was adopted by the blacks. If we must die. Claude McKay, we will be talking about him tomorrow. The poet of the Harlem Renaissance. He in fact wrote a poem on this, if we must die. Yes, here it is. If we must die, let it not be like hogs. Hogs are pigs. If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot. And that's what we do when we are killing hogs. White round us bark the mad and hungry dogs. So just as the dogs corner the hogs, chasing them, killing them, similarly, he says, we blacks are hounded by these white dogs, and they kill us, they oppress us, making their mock at our accused lot. And they are always accused. They are treated as criminals. What though before us lies the open grave? Like men we will fall, the murderous cowardly pack. We will face. Like men we will face the murderous cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying but fighting back. Pressed to the wall, dying but fighting back. So if we must die, let it not be like hogs. So this was the central voice of the blacks in America, not during Harlem alone, but more so after the Harlem, and it had started before Harlem. So Harlem was the climactic time for this voice, which gave militancy to the blacks, which gave them confidence, which gave them the courage to fight back. Let us not get the kicks, unretorted, and we must retort now. Time has come when we must fight, and fight to the finish, even if we have to die. So if we must die, let it not be like hogs, pressed to the wall, dying but fighting back. So that was the spirit. Anyway, I think enough so far as novelists are concerned. These are only the important ones, 4 or 5. There were several minor ones, but we don't need to know them. These 4 are important. Questions?
Right, absolutely, sir. It would be interesting to follow this with the discussion, and of course I would be raising a number of queries and observations that I made during the lecture, sir. You started with talking about Paul Dunbar, and you also mentioned how he wrote a number of really significant novels, and he was appreciated by a white novelist, white American novelist,
Yes.
Howells.
William Dean Howells.
Yes,
yeah.
yes, absolutely. And it is interesting to note, sir, that although these black writers, they could not find any mention in the history of American literature, yet people were appreciating them and people were acknowledging these black writers.
Yeah, but not people as such. It is the writers. And writer per se, to me, is above all these narrow boundaries of color, of race, ethnicity, faith, so on and so forth. So was William Dean Howells. So far as the common people are concerned, whites as well as blacks, they continue to live separately. And that is true of not only America. Think of other societies. These lines of race, ethnicity are so strong. Despite all progress, all globalization, everything, we have not really risen above them. There may be laws declaring us equal and so on, but are we really so? Do we really practice them? Because common people live the same customary life. Caste communities, caste prejudices, they go on. So that is not only in America, everywhere.
Right, absolutely, sir.
So Howells is a liberated person. He is a great writer. So he wouldn't think in terms of race or color. He would think in terms of good and bad. And he appreciated Dunbar as a great novelist. Yes.
Right. Just related to this, sir, there perhaps would have been more liberated writers like Howells, but even then, they perhaps were not able to include these black writers in the anthologies, or that they were ready to appreciate them, but not wanting to include them in the corpus.
Yeah, it's very strange. You see, Spiller's history came out in the 60s, late 60s, 1960s. So even as late as that, when slavery had been abolished for 100 years, where all equal rights have been granted by law to the blacks, but they are not being considered as part of America. They must add the prefix blacks. If you are Americans, they are also Americans, but they are not Americans. They are African Americans, Asian Americans, but not Americans. It's very strange. So Gramsci has cultural dominant theory, but actually it is politics. And he says that is why these days even literature studies are not free from politics, because your life is not free from politics. So you can't separate literature also from politics. So ideological interpretations will have to be made of literature also. And that is why the black American people, they have to come out with their own history. They said, all right, if you don't include, we will write our own history. But it is shameful. America, see, they think they are at the top of the world, and they are more advanced, they are superior culturally, intellectually, so on and so forth. And yet, this is the real situation, that they are hung up with color, they are hung up with these prejudices. Today, of course, there is the news that American companies now can go to moon and occupy territories. So another war is in the offing. Why Americans alone? Are they the owner of the planet, new planet moon? Why not other countries?
Absolutely. Why should they place a claim before anybody else?
I read it today in the newspaper, that now the American companies can go and occupy territory on the moon. Hell with it, why Americans alone? Why not others?
Absolutely.
Because now we have also sent men on the moon.
Right, sir.
So we can send more men and ask them, go and occupy.
It's a very interesting and amusing idea, sir. And today we have discussed 4 to 5 representative black American writers, and a lot of them talk about having been slaves, or that they knew somebody who was a slave. And could we see this idea as a common experience in all the blacks of the slave trade? Either they were slaves or somebody from their family, and they can we say that this experience comes in all of their writings?
Yeah, certainly, because it is something unforgettable. If you read the history, and people who have really gone there, the other day at a seminar which I had organized, Chamanlal, who was at JNU, he had lived in Mauritius and other countries where these British took away people for work, treated them as slaves and so on. You see, the kind of graphic stories he told us, you see, it shakes your bones, as Hamlet says, my bones quack. So you can't imagine the way they used to bring them, just like potatoes from Africa, and you see, pressed with a cover, and many of them would die of suffocation and starvation on the way. So they were not treated as humans. So by the time they reach the American coast, half of them will die. And then there, they would, dug a hole here and have an iron ring. So the whole day work on the farm, on the land, and at night the same, iron ring and chain, and tie them to the post like the animal.
That's terrible,
So
sir.
that is how they worked. And 2 pieces of bread to eat, nothing more. So very conscience pricking kind of.
Absolutely, absolutely. And of course, these memories become unforgettable when they have been ill-treated.
Yeah, as Jung says, racial memories, they continue for generations after generations. They are not easily forgotten.
Absolutely,
You
sir.
can't erase them from your memories.
Absolutely, sir. And then that is how they continue even today to come out in their writings, either through a direct aspect or an indirect aspect. And so we talked about Richard Wright, who uses more of a style of realism and naturalism. And then we talked about Ralph Ellison, who chooses to write in an entirely different style to focus on the very psyche of the black rather than trying to elaborate on the larger details. So, sir, which style was appreciated more or became more popular during that period?
Well, in their own times, both were popular. And in literary histories also, there are phases, there are movements. So there was a time when there was a movement of realism and naturalism. Although in America it reached late, in Europe it started in mid-19th century. Here it reaches in the 20th. Mid-19th century, you remember Balzac and Stendhal, French writers. They actually started it. Then in England, you had even Dickens, later Hardy. You see, they were writing, George Eliot. They were writing in that style of realism, naturalism. In America, it comes later. But then I think literary style has to be related to the subject in hand. If you are describing social life, I think realism is the best style to write in, because it permits you to give the graphic details of surface life. But if you are, having a peep into the inside of a human character, human psyche, human consciousness, then of course this is not the appropriate style.
True, sir.
Then the appropriate would be poetic style.
Poetic style.
And poetic style would include psychology, would include racial memory, so on and so forth. So you will need symbolism, you will need metaphor, you will need legends to communicate. You will need vision to communicate what is invisible.
True. So, very rightly said. So, it is literary style has to do with the subject at hand, and the different subjects are to be catered in a different manner. Absolutely, sir. And we also learned from you that Ralph Ellison, for the poetic style that he used, he took inspiration from James Joyce. And
well, James Joyce was a great influence on both sides of the Atlantic, as much in Europe as in America. Not merely the portrait of the artist as a young man, and not writing for the Ireland alone. He was known more of a stylist. He gave to the 20th century a new kind of fictional style to write in, where it could be meditative, it could be contemplative, it could be searching, it could be analytical, it could be recalling, it could be, say, memorizing, so on and so forth. Everything except the surface details. So it explores the interior life, the internal life, and that is why fiction becomes multi-dimensional in the hands of James Joyce.
Right, sir. And of course, then we can see also that the titles of the works of these few writers we discussed are very suggestive. Like sir pointed out, the fire next time, that the kind of atrocity that was committed with the blacks, that they could be burnt at any small
Baldwin,
yes.
yeah.
Absolutely, sir. And another title you mentioned by Paul Dunbar is The Uncalled.
Uncalled.
Yes.
Well, that also refers to the position of the blacks in America.
Absolutely, sir.
They are uncalled, means unwanted.
True.
Although they were brought, they didn't come on their own. But as I said in the very beginning, it's a question of who, Marx had said it long ago. You see, who owns the sources of production? That is where the power lies. So the whites did that. The blacks had no property right, no economic right, no political right. Women didn't have. I mentioned it earlier also. Even in England, the second Reform Bill, 1867, gave voting right to the workers, but not to women. Women got it half a century later, after World War I. In 1922, they got the voting right, imagine. Whereas men, even the workers, the lowest strata of society, they had been given the voting right in 1865. So these discriminations, levels of discriminations, unfortunately they have continued in most societies, including Asia, America, Africa, and they continue to be there.
Absolutely,
Even
absolutely,
today.
in some form or the other.
Yes.
They persist. And so just another question that comes up in my mind is that in these works, these black writers were coming up with, did they openly critique the whites, or perhaps just enumerate instances of discrimination against them? Did they try to put the whites in a very negative position?
Yeah, very rightly. You see, there also there is a difference of degrees. If you go back to their earliest writings in the 19th century, you find that it is subdued. It is more of a protest.
Right.
It is more of inviting self-pity. But as you go along into the 20th century, after World War I and then after World War II, you find that the voice of protest becomes louder and louder, and anger becomes more vocal and more public, and militancy, in fact, finally takes over, and they are ready to hit back to the whites. So it is progressive. From the 19th to the 20th, it has been rising. So from protest to militancy, that has been the course of black anger in America.
Right. That shows us a very interesting transition for where they were perhaps more afraid of criticism, of being shunned away, but as gradually time progresses, they are more vocal about it, like you mentioned, and the militancy takes over.
Yeah, because securities, safeties come with time. In the 20th century, they had legally been protected.
Right.
And they could go to courts, they could get justice. Earlier, there was no justice. You could kill and burn any black man, no courts will entertain, no
Right.
police will come to your rescue.
Right. And due to the views expressed in these particular works or novels, were there any novels as such and that were banned as well, but that were not allowed to be read by public because they contain such explicit criticism of the whites?
Yeah, explosive material. Yeah, there were, but then they had not been considered in terms of literariness very valuable.
Right.
They have their political side, their social side, but not really the literary value.
Right.
Literary value is only these writers that I mentioned.
Absolutely.
They are for all times. The literary value is that when you see are able to survive your time and you continue to be read and continue to be influential thereafter. So a sort of universality,
Right.
timelessness.
Right.
That is what would be characterized as greatness in literature.
Absolutely, absolutely. And very briefly, I would just like to emphasize one idea, like sir mentioned, the Harlem Renaissance slogan meant that if we must die, let us nobly die, and it became the theme for their struggle. But that becomes very interesting and significant to note.
Yeah, although borrowed from Churchill.
Absolutely.
Originally, you see Churchill's slogan in World War II, a great inspiring. I have his speeches with me. A very great orator. You see, I remember that day when the British Parliament was bombarded. You see, Hitler used to send several hundred bombers at a time.
Right.
200, 300. And the roof of British Parliament blasted. It is, fallen apart. And Churchill standing there.
Right.
Even at that time, not caring about what is falling around them, and speaking to the people and saying, we will fight on the land,
Right.
we'll fight on the sea, we'll fight in the street, fight there, fight here, and fight everywhere, but we will not surrender.
Absolutely, very well said, sir. And friends, with this, we have to bring our lecture to a close. So let us thank sir. Thank you so much, sir, for coming and talking to us. And friends, tomorrow we shall talk about poetry in depth. Thank you, friends, for watching. Have a great day.